follow along, I want to give you two passages, and you can hold the place, and we'll turn back and forth between James chapter 4 and Matthew chapter 7. I titled my thoughts, Lord, Make Me Average. And I preached this sermon a few months ago, or not a few months ago, a few years ago actually. And I wrote the title on the board, and a very clever member of the audience said, all your dreams have come true. Well, we want to be average at a particular point that we are going to talk about tonight, not in all of our Christianity, but in one very specific point that we will get to. But imagine you're walking down the beach and you find a bottle laying on the beach. You pick it up and you wipe the sand off of it, and as you do, a genie pops out of the bottle. So the genie says, I will grant your every wish. Whatever your wish is, it is my command. You can have anything you want. What would you ask for? Well, that's an easy one for me, because I've always wanted a red Corvette. That's what I'd ask for. But the more I think about it, I think that's not too wise. Wouldn't it be a whole lot better to ask for $1 million? Because then I would be able to buy a red Corvette and have money left over. But the more I think about it, wouldn't it be wiser to ask for $10 million, and then I could buy several red Corvettes and then still have millions of dollars left over? Chances are, our minds go to things like that. When somebody asks us, what do you want? We think about a bigger house, nicer clothes, a better car. We are just geared towards thinking about physical, material things all the time. That's what our life is geared around. And I understand why that is. The Bible teaches us that we have these desires of the flesh, the lust of the flesh. But in part, it is demanded of us, because we have to get up every morning, we have to go to work to supply our needs, and we get into this rut of only trying to get more and more and more. And that is a very dangerous place to get. Let me read to you in James chapter 4 what James has to say about what we have. He says, and we'll read, begin in verse 1, he says, From whence come wars and fightings among you? Come they not hence even of your lust that war in your members? There is a war going on in all of us who are Christians. A desire for the wealth of the world and the spiritual understanding that that's not what is important. And so this battle rages within us. He says in verse 2, Ye lust and ye have not, ye kill and desire to have and cannot obtain, ye fight and war, yet ye have not, listen to this, because ye ask not. And then in verse 3 he adds this, Ye ask and receive not, because ye ask amiss, that ye may consume it upon your lust. Reason you don't have, he says, is because you're asking for the wrong things. You're asking for the red Corvette. Hold your place there in James and go back to Matthew 7. And we read these verses last night, passed over them quickly, and we'll make comment on them now. Matthew 7, verse 1. He says, Ask and it shall be given you, seek and ye shall find, knock and it shall be opened unto you. Which sounds like a unconditional promise. You just ask God for whatever you want and he'll give it to you. He says, ask and you'll receive it. But as we spoke of last night, we have to put everything into context, and that doesn't fit the context of the rest of the scripture. Matthew or James 4, what did he say? You're asking for the wrong things. So God will give us what we ask for if we ask for the correct things. Again, going back to James. Hold your place there in Matthew. But in James chapter 1, he begins to explain to us how we ask and what we should ask for. Verse 6 of James 1, he says, But let him ask in faith, nothing wavering. For he that wavereth is like a wave of the sea, driven with the wind and tossed. For let not that man think that he shall receive anything of the Lord. So here is a condition. When we ask for something, we must first believe that God can provide it. We must ask in faith without wavering. Now again, back to Matthew 7. He says in verse 9, or what man is there of you whom if his son asks bread, will he give him a stone? Or if he asks a fish, will he give him a serpent? Who would do that to their children? The child comes up and says, Mom, Dad, I'm hungry. What parent would say, here's a rock, go eat it? Well, no parent would do that. Why? Because that rock would be worthless. What child would go up to a parent and say, I'm hungry, and the parent would give them a snake, something that's dangerous? No parent would do that. God is only going to give us, he is teaching, those things that will be beneficial for us. Not those things that are worthless, like a stone, not those things that are dangerous, like a serpent or a snake. He's only going to give those things that are best for us. So a whole lot of the Christian life, and when it comes to prayer, is understanding what it is we need to be asking for. I think there in James chapter 4, he very clearly explains, don't just ask for those things to satisfy your lust. Don't get on your knees and think, if I pray for a red Corvette, then God said he would give it to me. That's just fulfilling the lust. We have to be careful about what we ask for. You probably heard people mention it just like that. Be careful what you ask for, because you might just get it, they'll say. I used to work in Oklahoma. I worked up in that part of the country for 15 years, and I knew the area quite well. And there's a very large Native American Indian population in Oklahoma. And they have still there what they consider the 5 civilized tribes. Well, I knew quite a few of the Native American Indians, especially those from the tribe of the Cherokee. And the older ones would tell me stories about their parents and their grandparents, going all the way back to the Trail of Tears when they were driven out of the east over there into Oklahoma. And this is the story they tell me. And it is in fact a true story. It's not just a story, it's factual. The Osage Indians lived over in eastern Oklahoma. That's where the government had pushed them. It's a beautiful area. It's on the border of the Arkansas-Oklahoma line, and it's kind of the Ozark Hills, beautiful tall trees and green grass and plenty of streams and water, just a wonderful area. And that's where the Osage were at. The Cherokee, they were a warring tribe, and they looked at the Osage and they were jealous, because here were people who had plenty of fish to eat. They always had deer to eat. It was just wonderful hunting ground. So the Cherokee came over and they went to war with the Osage, and they drove them off the land. They won the battle, and that became the home now of the Cherokee. Well, the Osage had to go somewhere, and so the government gave them a new land. They put them up in northern Oklahoma, some of the worst land you've ever seen. You can't grow crops there. It's just rocky, and it's just a terrible land. Here are the Osage, driven out of their beautiful land, and they end up there in rocky soil. If you were to go back there today, you'd find a much different situation than what happened back in the late 1800s, early 1900s when the wars were going on. You can go over to that area where the Cherokee now live, very fertile ground, big trees and grass and wonderful streams and so forth, and you will find there a very, very depressed economy. Those Cherokee people are very poor. There are no jobs. Alcoholism is rampant. It's just a terrible area financially. And those Osage that got driven out of their land, you know what happened not long after they got put up there in northern Oklahoma? That terrible land? They found oil right beneath them. And they became an extremely wealthy tribe. Oh, those Cherokees, they got what they wanted. They got the beautiful land, and now they're a poor, depressed people. They could have had the oil. Be careful what you ask for. I tell you that story to lead up to this one. It's told in the Bible, a very similar story. A man named Abraham comes to his nephew Lot, and he says, our cattle and our livestock, they're too numerous for us to stay together. He said, I'm going to let you go wherever you want. If you want to go to the left, I'll go to the right. You want to go to the right, I'll go to the left. He said, you just pick your lane. And the Bible reads like this. It says that Lot lifted up his eyes and he saw the well-watered plains. He saw what the Cherokee saw. He saw beautiful land. And he said, that's what I'm going to take. We know what happened. It says that he pinched his tent towards Sodom. He headed right towards those wicked cities. He got what he wanted. He got the fertile ground. He got the well-watered plains to feed his cattle. But he took his family into sin and lost his family. Be careful. We can be like the Cherokees. We can be like Lot. We can see something that looks beautiful and we can go for it, not thinking about the consequences. If I could only live over here, I would have it made. If I could only have this job, if I only got this vehicle, and we drive our life towards that, not thinking about any kind of spiritual consequence. And too many of us have fallen into that trap where we strive only to fulfill our own lust. Unfortunately, many of us will end up like the Cherokees and like Lot, not lifting our eyes high enough. You know, the Bible says that Lot lifted up his eyes and he saw the well-watered plains, and that was his problem. He didn't lift his eyes high enough. If he would have kept looking and looked up into heaven and asked God and consulted with God what he should do, he would have been a whole lot better off. But he could not get his eyes above the wealth of this world. Let me turn you to Proverbs chapter 30. From this we get the title for our thoughts. Lord, make me average. Proverbs chapter 30. And I suspect many of you all have read Proverbs before, most I'm sure. This is one of those passages not often talked about, but it should be because there is just such tremendous wisdom in the two verses that we're going to read. Proverbs chapter 30. We will read verses 8 and 9. Solomon writes this. Beginning in verse 8, he says, remove far from me vanities and lies. Give me neither poverty, and I love that part of his prayer. Lord, don't make me poor. Don't give me poverty, but it's the next part that I'm not too fond of. He says, neither give me poverty nor riches. That's where I think, I don't think I want to pray that. But why was he saying that? Well, he's going to explain to us. He says, give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with food convenient for me, lest I be full and deny thee and say, who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and steal and take the name of my God in vain. Now let's think about this. This is amazing wisdom given to us by Solomon. He says, Lord, don't make me rich, because if I get rich, what's going to happen is I'm going to forget about you. But Lord, don't make me poor, because if I'm poor, then it's going to cause me to steal. So what I want, he says, is just the food that's convenient for me. In other words, make me average. Just give me enough. Think about the wisdom of that. Lord, just give me what I need. That was his prayer. What a beautiful prayer. And of course, this is from Proverbs. Of course, we know the author of most of Proverbs, although not necessarily this passage, was one of the wealthiest men who ever lived. And he would even conclude at the end of his life, Solomon would, that all his wealth was just vanity. It was just a waste of time, because he had focused only on satisfying his own earthly desires. He calls it here, in that 9th verse, or the 8th verse rather. The writer here, according to verse 1 of Proverbs 30, is Agur. And Agur says there in verse 8, feed me with a food that's convenient for me. What is he talking about? The food that is convenient for him. Well, it's mentioned in other places. In the book of Job, Job refers it as to the food that is necessary. And it's mentioned one other place, one that you all will surely know. Matthew chapter 6, Jesus' little model prayer, the Lord's Prayer. Do you remember what he said? Give me this day my daily bread. And all three of those are saying the same thing. The food that's convenient for me, my necessary food, or as Jesus puts it best, give me my daily bread. That's what I ask for. Now this is a hard concept for an American to understand. Something like this is taught much easier in third world countries. There's not a person in here who understands the concept of daily bread. None of us wake up in the morning and think, I wonder if I'll have bread today. We don't think like that. I would be shocked if there's somebody in this room that doesn't have a cabinet in their kitchen. I'd be shocked if there's somebody in this room who does not have a refrigerator in their house. And in that, we pack it full of food, and our cabinets are overflowing, and we have enough to eat today and tomorrow, and we could get snowed in, although we never get snowed in Austin, but you could get snowed in and eat for a month probably. We don't understand the concept of what these people were talking about, what Jesus was talking about when he said daily bread. But there's a large portion of our world who live just that way. They wake up in the morning and there is no cabinet in the house. There certainly is no food. They strive each day to have enough to eat. And here was a teaching from the wise man in Proverbs. That's enough. All you need is what's enough. Just get enough to get through the day. Of course, as I say, in America we're not used to that. We have enough and then some. But here's the danger with having too much. And I want to give you just a few examples. The first found in the book of Exodus chapter 5. And in Exodus 5, it's a well-known story. Aaron and Moses march into Pharaoh's palace and they say to Pharaoh, let my people go. They're there to lead them out of Egyptian bondage. Everybody knows that statement, let my people go. But does anybody remember what Pharaoh responded with? Let me read it to you. Exodus 5, verse 2. And Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? Pharaoh didn't even know who God was. They said, God says, let my people go. And his response is, who is God? He didn't know God. He didn't need to know God because he had the wealth of the world. He wasn't interested in serving anybody else. He was interested in them serving him. And it has long been a problem. And God knew that it would be a problem with people getting wrapped up in the wealth of the world. And so let me turn you to Deuteronomy chapter 6 and show you a warning that God gave to his people a long time ago. Deuteronomy chapter 6. Deuteronomy 6. Children of Israel are going to be given the promised land. Land that had been promised to them, that flowed with milk and honey, that was just a wonderful place. But before he gave it to them, this was the warning that God had for them. We'll begin in verse 10. And it shall be, when the Lord thy God shall have brought thee into the land which he sware unto thy fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give thee great and goodly houses, or goodly cities, which thou buildest not. He said, God's going to give you cities that have already been built. You didn't build them. He's just going to give them to you. Furthermore, he says, verse 11, and houses full of good things which thou fillest not. When you get the promised land, there's already going to be homes built for you, and they're going to be filled with goods. And he says, and wells dig which thou diggest not. You're just going to move into this house and already have a well there that someone else dug for you. Vineyards and olive trees which thou plantest not. But here's a warning. I'm about to give you all this. You're going to have cities, houses, wealth. You'll have wells dug. You'll have vineyards planted. You're going to have all of it. And then comes the warning. Verse 12. He says, then beware lest thou forget the Lord. Doesn't that make a lot of sense? Because we see that today. The more a person has, the less likely they are to be interested in serving a God. And of course, that is not a blanket statement. Doesn't mean that everybody who has any amount of wealth. But you can see that played out around this world. You go to a poor country, what are they interested in? They're interested in spiritual things. They're interested in a God. You go to a wealthy country like we find in Europe or especially in the United States, and there's not a thought one about God for the most part. And God knew that way back then. The more people have, the less likely they are to depend upon me. So how much do we need? That's a good question. Now, if you think I want to give you a dollar amount, you're going to be disappointed. I'm not going to tell you how much you can have until you have too much. But I am going to tell you a story, and I love this story. I think it's a great story, one of these little stories that would be good for all of us to think about from time to time. It was written by the Russian author Leo Tolstoy. And I know I'm probably speaking to a room full of individuals who read a lot of Tolstoy. I'm not one of them. Matter of fact, I never have read after Tolstoy. And I suspect not many of you all have either, but he wrote a book that is one of the great novels of all time. He wrote this book a number of years ago. Actually, this man, Leo Tolstoy, he lived back in, and wrote this book back in 1866. But his book that is so well known that he wrote was the book War and Peace. Back in 2009, the Newsweek magazine put together a list of the 100 greatest books ever written. Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace was number one on that list, which is pretty impressive. Until you begin to read the rest of the list, and you would probably disagree like I did with some of them. Number 27 on that list was On the Origin of the Species by Charles Darwin. Then coming in at number 36 was Winnie the Pooh. Then at number 41 was the Bible. So there's probably not a whole lot to that list, but still, Leo Tolstoy was considered one of the great authors of all time. And he wrote a short story. The short story was called How Much Land Does a Man Need? And here's how the story goes. A man comes to a town one day. This, of course, was written back in the 1800s. He shows up in this town, and the town brings him in, and they say, hey, we're going to offer you all the land that you want. All you have to do is walk around. As much land as you can walk around in a day, you can have that land. The only catch is you have to be back here at the starting line before the sun goes down. That's quite an offer, isn't it? All the land you can get around in one day. And so the day comes, the sun comes up, and that man starts out in a dead run. He runs just as hard as he can. He's going to cover as much ground as he can. The more ground he can cover, the more is his at the end of the day. And he runs, and he runs, and he runs. And the sun gets up high in the sky, and then it begins to set. And he thinks, I can go further. And so he runs, and he runs, and he runs. And the sun's starting to come back down, and he has to speed up, and so he runs faster to get to the finish line before the sun sets. And he crosses the finish line just before the sun sets. But he ran so hard all day that he fell over dead. And so this is what Leo Tolstoy concluded. How much does a man need? Well, they took that man and they laid him out and they buried him. And what a man needs is 6 feet of ground. Pretty interesting story, isn't it? Isn't that like our life? We run just as hard as we can to get more and more and more and more. And what's going to happen at the end? We're all going to fall over dead, and all we're going to need is 6 feet of ground. I'm afraid too many times we find ourselves caught up in this world, striving after things that don't amount to anything. We're going after the wrong things. Let me close by reading you a passage found in 1 Timothy chapter 6. 1 Timothy chapter 6. We'll read verses 6 through 10. I think this sums up all that we've tried to explain. Paul writes to his good friend Timothy, verse 6, but godliness and contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and it's certain we can carry nothing out. And having food and raiment, let us be therewith content. They that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare, into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. And I think that it is wise to point out that money is not the root of all evil. There is nothing wrong with money. Money is essential. As a matter of fact, money plays a big role in the Lord's church. That's how we spread the gospel. But the problem is the love of money. And may we never be guilty. Loving money, loving the wealth of the world. Because when it's all said and done, all you need is 6 feet of ground. I close with that. If you're here subject to the gospel call, we beg and plead you not to leave this place without making things right with your God. Won't you come us together?